They said no white man who followed an Apache woman into the dark ever came back the same. And Ethan Cole heard every word of it as the last light drained from the sky, and the wind carried dust across the empty street like a warning no one dared to speak aloud. Yet when she stood there at the edge of town, still as a carved figure in the fading gold of sunset, and told him, "Come at midnight," she didn't raise her voice, didn't explain, didn't even wait to see if he would answer. She simply turned and walked away, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a choice that settled heavy in his chest, because men in that town had learned to fear silence more than threats. And there was something in the way she spoke that didn't feel like a trap, didn't feel like anger. It felt measured, deliberate, as if she had already decided something about him that he hadn't yet decided about himself. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the stories, not the warnings, but the quiet certainty in her eyes, the kind that didn't ask for permission, the kind that didn't belong to someone who needed anything from a man like him. Ethan stood there a long moment after she disappeared beyond the last building. The sound of a loose shutter knocking softly in the breeze, the smell of dry wood and horse leather hanging low in the air, and behind him, voices began to rise, low at first, then sharper. Men who had watched the exchange from porches and doorways, men who had seen enough years on that land to know when something wasn't right. "You ain't thinking of going," one of them muttered, spitting into the dirt like the thought itself tasted bad. Another shook his head slow. "Apache don't call you out at midnight unless they already dug the hole." A few nervous laughs followed, thin and brittle, but Ethan didn't turn around, didn't answer, because he wasn't listening to them anymore. He was replaying that single moment, the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with hate, but with something harder to name, something that felt almost like recognition, and that made no sense, because he had never seen her before in his life, or at least, that's what he told himself as the sky turned from amber to deep blue and the first stars began to break through. Time moved different out there, slower, heavier, every minute stretching like it was asking him to decide who he was before the night made the decision for him. Inside his small cabin just past the edge of town, Ethan sat with his hat resting on his knee, fingers tracing the worn crease along its brim, the same hat he'd worn through dust storms, long drives, quiet mornings. A life built on simple choices that never asked more of him than hard work and steady hands. But this wasn't simple. This was a line drawn somewhere he couldn't quite see, and he knew crossing it meant stepping into something that didn't follow the rules he understood. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second marking the distance between safety and whatever waited beyond it. He could stay. No one would blame him. They'd nod, say he was smart, say he knew better than to chase shadows into Apache land, or he could ride out, follow a woman who owed him nothing, into a night that offered no guarantees. And as the minute hand reached closer to 12, Ethan let out a slow breath, stood up, and reached for his coat. Because some choices didn't come from reason. They came from something quieter, something that refused to let a man sit still when he knew there was truth waiting in the dark. And out there, somewhere beyond the last lantern, she was already waiting. The night air had a way of pressing in on a man once he stepped beyond the last trace of lantern light. And Ethan Cole felt it settle on his shoulders the moment his horse carried him past the edge of town, where the ground turned from worn paths into open desert, quiet and endless, the kind of quiet that did not belong to empty places, but to places that were watching. The wind moved low across the sand, lifting thin trails of dust that curled around his boots and faded just as quickly, and every sound felt sharper, the creak of saddle leather, the slow rhythm of hooves striking packed earth. Even his own breath seemed louder than it should have been, as if the night wanted him to hear himself think, to measure every doubt before it. Was too late to turn back, but he did not slow, not because he was certain, but because turning around would have meant admitting that the men in town were right, that fear drew the lines he lived by, and that was not a truth he was willing to carry, not tonight. The sky stretched wide above him, a deep black scattered with stars that looked close enough to touch, cold and distant, the kind of sky that made a man feel small if he let it. But Ethan had spent enough years under open horizons to know that feeling small was not the same as being weak. It was just a reminder that there were things older than him, older than the town, older than every rule he had been taught to follow. And somewhere out there, she was part of that older world, moving within it like she belonged to it in a way he never could. He rode for nearly 20 minutes, maybe closer to 30, time stretched thin out there, until the land began to shift. The flat ground breaking into shallow ridges and stone outcroppings that cast long shadows under the moonlight. And he recognized the place without ever having been there before, a narrow canyon mouth that cut into the earth like a scar, dark and silent, the kind of place that held its own secrets and did not offer them easily. Ethan slowed his horse to a stop just outside the entrance, the animal shifting beneath him, uneasy, ears flicking toward the stillness ahead, and he reached down, resting a hand against its neck, steadying it without a word. Because some silences were better left unbroken, he listened, not for movement, not for danger, but for anything that might tell him he had made the wrong choice. And for a moment, there was nothing, no voices, no footsteps, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. And that was when the doubt tried to settle in, quiet and persistent, the kind that did not shout but whispered, asking him if he had followed a shadow too far, if he had mistaken a glance for something meaningful when it was nothing more than a passing moment. His grip tightened slightly on the reins, not from fear, but from the weight of not knowing, because not knowing left a man exposed in ways he could not prepare for. Then, somewhere deeper in the canyon, a small sound shifted the air, not loud, not sudden, just enough to break the stillness, like a foot brushing against loose gravel, and Ethan lifted his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the darkness, waiting, and then another sound answered from a different direction, and another, spaced apart, measured, not rushed, not hidden, as if whoever stood out there wanted him to understand something before he even saw them. The space around him was no longer empty. It was occupied, filled with presence rather than movement. And though he could not yet see a single face, he knew he was no longer alone. Yet no one stepped forward, no voice called out, no weapon was raised. Only the silence remained, heavier now, deliberate, as if the night itself had drawn a circle around him and was waiting to see what kind of man stood inside it. Ethan did not reach for his gun, did not turn his horse. He simply sat there, breathing slow, steady, because whatever this was, whatever she had meant when she told him to come, it had already begun long before he arrived, and leaving now would not undo it. It would only prove that he had never intended to understand it at all. The silence did not break. It shifted, and that difference settled into Ethan Cole's bones before his eyes could confirm what his instincts already understood. The canyon was no longer empty space. It was a held breath, a presence layered in the dark where shapes moved just enough to remind him that he had stepped into something that did not belong to him. His horse let out a low, uneasy sound. Not fear, but awareness. The kind that came from sensing more than sight could explain, and Ethan slid slowly from the saddle, boots touching the ground with deliberate calm, because standing tall on horseback felt wrong now. Too exposed, too distant from whatever was waiting. He kept one hand lightly on the reins, not to control the animal, but to steady himself, to stay anchored to something familiar as the unknown closed in around him. And then, without warning but without surprise, the first figure stepped forward, not from the front, but from the side, where shadow met stone. A man, silent, posture straight, eyes fixed not with hostility but with something measured, something that felt like judgment held back rather than already decided. Then another shape appeared behind him, and another, until the edges of the canyon seemed to breathe people into existence, not rushing, not threatening, simply revealing what had already been there all along. Ethan counted without meaning to, 5, 10, more beyond that, each one positioned with intention, spaced, as if part of something practiced, something older than any rule he had lived by. Yet none of them raised a weapon, none of them spoke, and that was what made the moment tighten around him. Not danger, but restraint, because restraint meant choice, and choice meant this was not what the men in town had warned him about. This was something else entirely, something he had not been prepared to understand. His eyes moved slowly across the figures, taking in the details the moonlight allowed, the stillness of their stance, the quiet confidence in how they held the ground. And then he saw her, not at the front, not hidden either, but standing where the line of shadows opened just enough to draw the eye. Nielli stepped forward with the same calm certainty she had shown at sunset, her presence cutting through the tension without breaking it, her gaze finding his as if the distance between them had never existed, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away, the canyon, the watchers, even the weight of the night itself, because in her eyes there was no surprise that he had come, no doubt, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had done exactly what she had expected all along. "You came," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying through the still air without effort, and Ethan nodded once, not out of obedience, but because there was nothing else to say that would not break something fragile in the moment. She studied him then, not quickly, not with suspicion, but with a kind of attention that felt deeper than a glance, as if she was confirming something she had already believed before he ever arrived. Then her hand moved, slow and deliberate, reaching beneath the fold of her garment, and for the briefest second, the memory of every warning he had heard flickered through his mind. Not fear, just awareness. But what she drew out was not a weapon. It was something small, something that caught the moonlight and held it, a silver glint that seemed too quiet for the weight it carried. And when she stepped closer, closing the space between them by just a few feet, the figures behind her remained still, not moving to follow, not closing in, simply watching, as if this moment belonged only to the two of them. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, her voice softer now, but no less steady, and Ethan's eyes dropped to the object in her hand, something about it familiar in a way he could not place, something that stirred a memory just out of reach, like a name he had forgotten, but knew he should remember. And when he shook his head slightly, she did not look disappointed, she only nodded once, as if she had expected that answer too. "Then you came for a reason. You do not yet understand," she said, and the words settled between them, heavier than any threat could have been, because for the first time since he had ridden out into the dark, Ethan realized this night had never been about whether he would survive it. It had always been about what he would discover when he did. The silver caught the moonlight in a way that made it feel older than the night itself, not bright, not polished, but worn smooth by time and touch, and Ethan Cole found his eyes drawn to it despite himself, as if something beneath his thoughts recognized it before his memory could catch up. Nielli held it steady in her open palm, not offering it, not pulling it away, simply letting it exist between them like a question neither of them had fully asked yet, and the canyon remained silent around them, the figures behind her unmoving, patient, as though they had seen moments like this before and understood the weight of waiting. Ethan took a slow step closer, not out of trust, but because standing still felt like turning away, and he had not come this far to turn away from something he could not yet name. The ground shifted softly under his boots, small grains of sand sliding against stone, a quiet reminder that even the smallest movement mattered here. His gaze lifted briefly to meet hers again, searching for something, a clue, a warning, anything that might tell him what kind of path he had stepped onto. But her expression did not change, calm, steady, certain in a way that did not ask for agreement, only presence. "Where did you get that?" he asked finally, his voice low, careful not to disturb the fragile balance that seemed to hold the entire canyon in place. She did not answer right away. Instead, she closed her fingers gently around the object, not hiding it, but acknowledging the question as something that deserved more than a quick reply. Then she turned slightly, just enough for the moonlight to fall differently across her face, revealing lines of thought that had been there long before this night. "It was not mine to find," she said, each word measured, as if chosen from a place deeper than language. "It was mine to keep, until the one who carried its memory came back." The words settled into Ethan's chest with a weight that did not feel like a threat, but like recognition trying to surface, something distant, something tied to a time he had never questioned before. His brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in the effort of reaching for something just beyond his grasp. "I have never been here," he said, the statement simple, honest, yet uncertain in a way he could not explain. Nielli watched him for a moment longer, then stepped closer, closing the distance until the space between them felt deliberate, chosen. "Not here," she said quietly, "but somewhere else, long before this night." Her hand opened again, and this time, she extended the silver piece toward him, not as a gift, not as an offering, but as something that belonged to the space between them rather than to either of them alone. Ethan hesitated, not because he feared it, but because taking it felt like crossing another line, one that could not be stepped back from. Yet the longer he stood there, the more he understood that the line had already been crossed the moment he chose to come. His hand moved slowly, fingers closing around the cool surface of the object, and the instant it touched his skin, something shifted, not in the world around him, but within him, a faint echo, a memory not fully formed, a voice perhaps, or a feeling tied to a place he had not visited in years. If ever, his grip tightened slightly as he lifted it closer to the light, studying its shape, the worn edges, the small markings etched into its surface, symbols he did not recognize but felt drawn to, as though they held meaning he had forgotten rather than never learned. Behind Nielli, one of the older figures shifted, not stepping forward, not interrupting, just a slight movement that carried the weight of acknowledgement, and Ethan sensed then that this was not a private moment. It was witnessed, held by more than just the two of them. "Why me?" he asked, the question quiet, but heavier than anything he had said so far. Nielli's gaze did not waver. "Because you came," she answered, and for a moment, that seemed like too simple an answer, until he realized it was not about the act itself, but what it meant, that he had chosen to step into something he did not understand, to stand in a place where he held no control, no certainty, only the willingness to remain. And in that realization, Ethan felt the first true shift of the night, not in danger, not in fear, but in the understanding that whatever this was, whatever this connection reached back to, it had been waiting, not for just any man, but for the one who would not turn away when the path disappeared into the dark. The metal felt colder the longer Ethan Cole held it, not the kind of cold that came from the night air, but something deeper, something that seemed to carry time inside it. And as his thumb traced along the worn edge, a faint groove caught his skin, a small imperfection that felt intentional, like a mark left behind for someone meant to notice it. His breath slowed without him meaning to, and the canyon around him seemed to draw tighter, not closing in, but focusing, as if every pair of unseen eyes had shifted their attention to that single object now resting in his hand. He lifted it slightly, angling it toward the moonlight, and there, along its surface, he saw it, a faint etching, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, a pattern that stirred something unsettled in his memory. Not a clear image, not a full recollection, just a feeling, like hearing a melody you had not thought about in years but still recognized in your bones. "I have seen this before," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But Nielli heard it, her expression changing just enough to show that the words mattered. Not surprise, not relief, but confirmation, as if a piece of something long set in motion had finally aligned. She stepped half a pace closer, her voice low, steady. "Not with your eyes," she said, "but through someone who carried it before you." Ethan's gaze lifted from the object to her face, the weight of her words settling slowly, carefully, because they did not demand belief. They asked for something else, something harder, the willingness to remember without proof. And that was not something he was used to giving, not in a world where everything was measured by what a man could see, touch, or hold on to. Yet standing there, with the canyon holding its breath around him and that small piece of silver anchoring him to something unseen, he felt the edges of his certainty begin to shift. "My family has been on that land for as long as I can remember," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain. "There is no story like that." Nielli did not argue, did not challenge him. She only turned her head slightly, and from the line of still figures behind her, an older man stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, each step carrying a quiet authority that did not need to be announced. His hair was streaked with gray, his posture straight despite the years that showed in his face. And when he reached the edge of the space between them, he stopped, his gaze moving from Ethan to the object in his hand and back again, as if measuring something that had nothing to do with the present moment. "Stories are not always told to those who carry them," the man said, his voice calm, carrying the weight of something learned over time rather than something spoken often. Ethan listened, not because he understood, but because something in the way the man spoke made it impossible to dismiss. "Sometimes they are kept," the man continued, until the one who needs to hear them is ready to stand where you are standing now." The words settled into the space like stones placed carefully into a foundation, each one building towards something Ethan could not yet see, but could feel taking shape beneath his feet. He glanced down at the silver again, his grip loosening slightly, not in rejection, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood now that it was not something to hold tightly, but something to receive. "Then tell me," Ethan said, his voice steady, though something deeper had shifted beneath it. "Tell me what I am standing in." Nielli's eyes did not leave his, but it was the older man who answered. "You are standing between what was given and what was forgotten," he said, and the canyon seemed to absorb the words, holding them there like a truth that did not need to be repeated. Ethan felt a slow breath leave his chest, not from tension, but from the realization that whatever this night had brought him to, it was not asking him to fight, not asking him to defend. It was asking him to listen, and that was something no one in his world had ever taught him to do in a place like this. Yet here he was, standing under a sky that felt larger than it had before, holding a piece of something that did not belong to him alone, and for the first time, he did not feel like an outsider in that space. He felt like someone who had arrived late, to a story that had been waiting for him all along. The words did not echo, they settled, and Ethan Cole felt them take hold somewhere deeper than thought, as if the ground beneath his boots had shifted just enough to remind him he was no longer standing on what he understood. The silver in his hand seemed heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning, and for a moment he considered giving it back, not out of rejection, but because it no longer felt like something he had the right to carry without knowing the cost. Yet his fingers did not release it. They tightened instead, not in possession, but in acceptance of something unfinished. The older man studied him quietly, as if that small choice had answered more than any words could have. Then he turned his gaze toward Nielli, and though no words were spoken between them, something passed in that glance, something agreed upon long before Ethan had arrived. Nielli stepped forward again, this time not stopping at a distance, but closing the space until she stood just a few feet from him, close enough that the faint scent of sage and smoke clung to the air between them, grounding the moment in something real, something present. "There was a winter," she began, her voice softer now, but carrying the same steady weight. "Long before you were born, long before this land was divided by lines that were never meant to last." Ethan did not interrupt, did not question. He simply listened, because he understood now that this was not a story meant to be rushed. "A woman came to our people," Nielli continued. "She was alone, sick, and the cold had already begun to take what strength she had left. Many would have turned her away, not out of cruelty, but because survival leaves little room for strangers. But one did not." Her eyes flicked briefly to the older man, then back to Ethan. "My grandmother." The name was not spoken, but it carried the weight of someone whose presence still lived in the memory of those who stood behind her. "She chose to see a person, not a threat. She brought that woman into our camp, cared for her, gave her what little we had, not because it was easy, but because it was right." Ethan felt his breath slow again, the edges of something familiar beginning to form, not a memory he could claim, but one that seemed to recognize him all the same. "When the winter passed, the woman left," Nielli said. "But she did not leave empty-handed. She carried something with her, something given not as a payment, but as a promise, that what was done in kindness would not be forgotten." Ethan looked down at the silver in his hand. The connection no longer distant, no longer uncertain. It was there, clear enough to feel even if he could not yet see the full shape of it. "That woman," the older man said quietly, his voice joining the story without breaking it, "carried your blood." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight that Ethan could not ignore. His mind moved quickly, searching through fragments, stories told around quiet tables, names spoken without context, moments that had never seemed important until now. His mother's voice, distant but clear, telling him once about her mother, about a winter she never spoke of in detail, only that it had changed something in her, something she never fully explained. Ethan's grip tightened again, not in doubt this time, but in recognition, incomplete but undeniable. "She never told me," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. Nielli nodded slightly. Some stories are carried in silence, she said, until the time comes for them to be spoken where they matter. The canyon remained still, the figures behind her unmoving. Yet the space felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded, as if something that had been unbalanced had found its place again. Ethan looked from Nielli to the older man and back again, the weight of the moment settling fully into him, not as a burden, but as something that asked for more than acknowledgement, something that required a choice, not about staying or leaving, but about what it meant to carry forward what had been given long before he had any say in it. And for the first time since the night began, Ethan understood that he had not been called there to prove anything. He had been called there to remember something that had never truly been lost, only waiting for the moment someone would be willing to stand still long enough to see it. The canyon did not change, but Ethan Cole did, and that difference settled into the way he stood, the way his shoulders eased without losing their strength, the way his eyes no longer searched for an exit but stayed where they were, steady, present, as if he had finally stopped measuring the moment against the world he came from. The silver rested in his palm like it belonged there now, not as something borrowed, but as something returned. And for the first time since the night began, he did not question why it had been given to him. He only felt the weight of what it meant to carry it forward. Nielli watched him closely, not with expectation, not with pressure, but with a quiet patience that suggested this part of the story had never been hers to control, only to guide. The older man stepped back slightly, not leaving, but giving space, as if what needed to happen next could not be witnessed the same way the past had been, and the figures behind them remained still, their presence no longer a circle of judgment, but something closer to a boundary, holding the moment in place without interfering. Ethan took a slow breath, the night air cool against his lungs, carrying the faint scent of earth and sage, grounding him in something real, something immediate. "If what you say is true," he began, his voice low but clear, "then this was never about me choosing to come here." He paused, not searching for the right words, but allowing the ones that came to settle into place. "It was about whether I would listen when it mattered." Nielli nodded once, her gaze steady. "And you did," she said, and there was no praise in her voice, no reward, only acknowledgement, the kind that did not need to be repeated. Ethan looked down at the silver again, then back up at her. "Then what happens now?" he asked, and for the first time, there was something in his tone that was not uncertainty, not doubt, but readiness, not for action, but for understanding. Nielli did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned slightly, her eyes moving across the canyon, across the figures who had stood in silence. Through it all, then back to him. "Now," she said quietly, "you decide what to do with something that was never meant to be kept hidden." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that reached beyond the canyon, beyond the night, beyond even the story that had brought him there. Ethan felt that weight settle into him, not as pressure, but as responsibility, something he could not ignore now that he understood it. He thought of the town behind him, the men who spoke in half-truths and warnings shaped by fear, the lines they drew without knowing where they began, and for a moment, he saw those lines clearly for what they were, not boundaries, but habits, passed down without question, accepted without challenge. And he realized that what he carried in his hand was not just a memory of something better. It was a chance to change something that had been left unchanged for too long. "They will not believe it," he said quietly, not as an excuse, but as a truth he understood well. Nielli met his gaze without hesitation. "Belief is not where change begins," she said. "It begins where someone chooses to stand differently, even when no one else does." The canyon seemed to hold those words longer than the others, as if they mattered in a way that went beyond this moment. Ethan nodded slowly, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood the direction, and sometimes that was enough. He turned slightly, glancing toward his horse, still waiting where he had left it, calm now, as if it too had sensed the shift in the air. Then he looked back at Nielli, at the older man, at the silent figures who had watched without judgment, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was standing between two worlds. He felt like he was part of both, not because he had earned it, but because he had chosen not to turn away from it. "Then I will carry it," he said simply, not as a promise spoken for others, but as a decision made for himself. and Nielli's expression softened just slightly, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something that spoke of a balance restored rather than a victory won. And as the night stretched on around them, the silence no longer felt like a test. It felt like understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be known. The decision did not echo with triumph. It settled quietly, like dust after a long ride. And Ethan Cole felt it in the way the night seemed to loosen its grip around him, not releasing him, but no longer holding him in question. The silver remained in his hand, no longer strange, no longer distant, but familiar in a way that did not need explanation, as if it had always been waiting for him to recognize it rather than discover it. Nielli watched him for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. Not approval, not relief, but acknowledgement that something had been completed, not by her, not by the tribe, but by him. The older man stepped back again, returning to the line of figures who had remained silent through it all, and one by one, without signal or sound, they began to shift, not leaving in haste, not turning away, but stepping back into the shadows from which they had come, their presence fading into the canyon like breath into cold air, until only Nielli remained in front of him, the space no longer crowded, no longer watched in the same way, but still holding the weight of what had just passed between them. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came when a man realized something had changed without needing to be forced. He glanced once more at the silver, then carefully slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, not hiding it, but placing it close, where it would not be forgotten again. "Will I see you again?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying something beneath it that he did not try to name. Nielli looked at him, her expression calm, steady as it had been from the beginning. "You already have," she said, and for a moment, that answer might have felt like a riddle, but now it did not. Now it felt like truth spoken without decoration, because this meeting was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something that had never truly ended. Ethan nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was, not needing more, not asking for certainty where none was required. The wind moved again through the canyon, softer now, carrying with it the faint sound of distant movement, not approaching, not retreating, simply existing beyond the edges of what he could see. Nielli turned then, not abruptly, not as if leaving, but as if stepping back into the place she belonged, her figure moving with quiet purpose toward the shadows. And for a brief moment, she paused, glancing over her shoulder, not to check if he was still there, but as if marking the moment in a way words could not hold. Then she continued on, her form blending into the darkness until she was no longer separate from it. And Ethan stood alone once more, though it did not feel like before. It did not feel empty. It felt full in a way he could not have explained a few hours earlier. He turned toward his horse, the animal calm, steady, as if the night had passed through it just as it had passed through him. And with a practiced motion, he mounted, settling into the saddle with the ease of habit, but carrying something new beneath it, something quieter, something that would not show in the way he rode, but would shape where he chose to go. He took one last look at the canyon, not searching, not expecting anything more, just acknowledging the place for what it had given him. Then he turned the horse back toward the direction of town, the path ahead no clearer than before, but no longer uncertain in the same way, because now it was not about knowing where the road led. It was about knowing why he chose to walk it. And as the horse began to move, slow at first, then steady, the night seemed to open in front of him rather than close behind. And somewhere beneath the quiet rhythm of hooves against the earth, Ethan understood that what he carried with him was not just a story, not just a memory, but a line that had been redrawn, not in the sand, not in the land, but in the way a man chose to see the world when no one was there to tell him how. The town was quiet when Ethan Cole arrived back, the kind of quiet that settled in after the heat of the day had passed, when the streets were empty and the air held the promise of coolness but hadn't quite reached it yet. The town hadn't changed, not in the way he had expected, but in the way he could no longer ignore, as if the very earth beneath his boots had shifted, not in its physicality, but in the way it held its own weight now, aware, waiting for something that had not been there before. He rode slowly through the familiar streets, his eyes scanning the same storefronts, the same wooden posts that had been there for years, but nothing looked the same now, not the way the sun had once made them appear bright, Not the way the faces he had known seemed to hold meaning before. Now everything felt a little smaller, a little more fragile. He passed the saloon where the sounds of laughter and shouting usually filled the air, but tonight it was empty. The doors swinging gently in the breeze. A lone figure leaning against the corner post, his back to Ethan, eyes fixed on something far off. A moment of stillness before the movement that would pull him back to the present. Ethan's horse slowed. The rhythmic clip of hooves softened on the worn cobblestone, and for a moment he wondered if the man would turn, if the man would even notice him. But then, as if the air itself had shifted just enough, the figure looked up, eyes narrowing as he saw Ethan. The man straightened, the lines on his face tightening with recognition, a hint of something in the way he stepped forward, not with fear, not with confrontation, but with something more complex, something that had not been there before. "Did you find what you were looking for?" the man asked, his voice rough with years of unspoken words, of things left to be said but never voiced. Ethan looked at him, at the way his hands rested on the worn wood of the post, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the town itself. And he knew the question wasn't just about the town or the ride or the silver in his pocket. It was about everything that had brought him here, everything that had shaped him and led him to this moment. Ethan exhaled slowly, then looked past the man, his gaze drifting over the quiet street, the silent buildings, the space between them that seemed to hold something unsaid. "I found what I needed," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of what had changed, the weight of understanding, not just of the land, but of himself. The man nodded slowly, his face unreadable for a moment before he straightened again, a glint of something in his eyes, not relief, but something close to acceptance. "Then you know it was never about the land," the man said, his voice softer now, the hardness that had once held his words steady slipping away. "It was never about finding what was hidden. It was about remembering what was always there, waiting for you to see it." Ethan looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and in that moment, he understood that the man wasn't talking about the town or the land or the silver. He was talking about something deeper, something older, something that had never been lost, only forgotten, waiting for someone to stand still long enough to see it again. The man stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, and for the first time since he had arrived in town, Ethan did not feel the weight of being an outsider, of being separate from the world around him. He felt, instead, like someone who had finally come home, not to the place, but to the truth of it, to the memory of it, the truth of what had been given and taken, and what had always been waiting to be remembered. He nodded once to the man, then turned his horse slowly, not toward the open road, but toward the place he knew now that he belonged, where the lines he had once seen so clearly had blurred, and the space between the past and the future had finally closed, leaving him standing in the present, ready to carry what he had learned and to walk the road that had always been his to travel.